Welcome to the second program in our Pathways to Peace series, and thank you all for coming out during this very wintry winter we're experiencing in Fort Wayne. The Federation provides a variety of programs and services here in our community, including our annual People of the Book program, Yom HaShoah service, and Confronting the Shoah classes, educating about the history and events of the Holocaust, and of course, this lecture series. We host the Camp Joe Levine Day Camp and provide other programming for kids. We are a partner with Congregation Achdut B'Shalom and Congregation B'nai Jacob in Thoughtful Thursdays, providing food bags to the families of 85 Head Start students. Through our annual fundraising campaign, we also support the State of Israel, as well as agencies that offer assistance to Jews in need, there, here in the United States, and around the world. We express our appreciation to the Dr. Harry W. Salem Foundation and the Dr. Lewis and Ann Schneider Foundation for their support of this Pathways to Peace series. It is now my pleasure to introduce Jackie Schreier, the Executive Director of the Federation, who will introduce our speaker.
Good evening, and thank you, too, for being here with us. If I can ask you to please take a moment to make sure that your cell phones are off, if you have not done that yet. We encourage you to consider becoming a member of the Jewish Federation of Fort Wayne. Membership cards are on the table at the back of the room. Hold it up. There you go, Steve. Along with email sign-up sheets, so that you can stay connected with us on the many programs that we sponsor and that we have open to our community. Out of courtesy for tonight's speaker, please refrain from asking questions or making loud comments during his talk. We have allowed time for questions and answers, and we'll make every attempt to make sure that your question is answered thoroughly. We welcome you to join us for upcoming programs in the Pathways to Peace series. The title of tonight's talk is The Fourth Stage of the Arab-Israel Conflict. Alan Dowty is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. He is a graduate of Schimmer College and the University of Chicago, where he received his PhD in history. He has taught at Hebrew University, the University of Notre Dame, and the University of Calgary, where he was the first holder of the Khanuk Chair of Israel Studies. He has served as visiting professor at numerous universities, including Oxford, Buffalo, Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Schimmer College. He has published numerous books and articles on the Arab-Israel conflict, Israel, U.S. foreign policy, and other topics, including basic tests on Israeli politics and the Arab-Israel conflict. He has also served as president of the Association of Israel Studies from 2005 to 2007. So please join me in welcoming Professor Alan Dowty.
Thank you very much. This is an amazing crowd. I have to congratulate the organizers here on having really done their job. Just got back from a tour of Canada, where sometimes the audience is for 8 or 10. Of course, the weather has something to do with it. I actually have family ties to this region. My father grew up in North Manchester. And in fact, I have a family representative here, Rex. So it's on my sort of a special occasion. Now, I was asked to speak about the current peace talks, and I promise you that I will get there. But it always seems important to me, in order to understand the significance of what's happening, to put this in perspective. And I often tell the story of my friend Harry. Harry came to visit while I was living in Jerusalem. course, we took Harry to the Western Wall, where people write their prayers on a little petakim, right? Put them in the wall. And Harry had not been very religious, as far as I knew, but he said he wanted to write a petak to God. So he wrote it, put it in the wall, and I asked Harry what he had asked for. He said, I asked God for world peace in 10 years. Well, I said, world peace is always good, but why 10 years in particular? And Harry said, you have to understand, God has a strange sense of time. It says in the Bible, 1,000 years are but a moment in His sight. So if you want to enjoy world peace in your own lifetime, you better be specific. Now, to transfer that to what we're talking about here is simply this, that if you take a long-term perspective on the Arab-Israel conflict, it will actually make you more hopeful. There are plenty of reasons in the last 10 years to be anything but hopeful. But in a longer perspective, it's a little bit of a better story. The conflict has been marked, as I see it, by 4 stages, with the 4th stage emerging since the turn of the 20th century. The first stage, from its origins in the 1880s until the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, were 2 communities in Palestine, and this is a photo, probably can't see too well. Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, visiting in El Arish in 1898 to try to find a place for the Jewish homeland. They didn't decide on El Arish instead. The second stage, beginning with the creation of Israel until the late 1980s, this became an interstate conflict between the new state of Israel and its Arab neighbors. The neighboring Arab states have played only a marginal role in it, really up to them. I define a change in the stage of the conflict as a change in the overall stakes of the conflict and the major actors. During this stage, the Palestinians, the Arabs in Palestine themselves, were really temporarily eclipsed as a major actor in this. The third stage, which had roots in the 1960s, but really fully emerged after the first Intifada, which began in 1987, we see the re-emergence of the Palestinians as the major actor opposite Israel. And so what had been Arab-Israel conflict, which is a label we still use, really becomes more and more of an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And you probably remember, this is a mature audience, I see, this gentleman here, who represents or symbolizes this third phase, the re-emergence of the Palestinians. And then in the last decade, we've had the second Intifada, the outbreak of violence once more, and the collapse of the peace process that marked the end of the third stage. And we've seen the rise of radical religious forces that change in some ways the very nature of the conflict. New actors, Hamas, Hezbollah, names that weren't a part of this before, in the state of Iran. These are young children going through military training in a Hamas military camp in Gaza. Now, just a little bit of background here. This is a map of Palestine, or that area, during the Ottoman period, before World War I. There was no unit named Palestine. What you had were different districts here, including what's now the northern part of Israel, that were governed from Beirut, this area here, and the southern part of what is now Israel, centered in Jerusalem, was governed directly from Constantinople by the Ottomans, in recognition of its historic importance. Now, initially, going back to the origins of the conflict, the first stage, neither side recognized that there was another party. They didn't see that there was another people there with collective claims to the area with whom to negotiate. It's hard to imagine a gap wider than that. There isn't even another party to talk to. The Arabs and the Turks regarded the Jews who had come into the area as a religion, representatives of religion, as European colonialist settlers. And the Jewish settlers who were coming in saw the Arabs in Palestine as individuals, not as a group, but as individuals who would benefit from the establishment of the Jewish homeland. It was only toward the end of the mandate, I'm giving you 130 years of history in 20 minutes, so bear with me. Only towards the end of the British mandate in 1937 did the Jewish leadership, over much opposition and with many reservations, accept the idea of partitioning Palestine into two states. Since there were two peoples with claims, two states, a fairly logical idea. What we today call the two-state solution has its origins here. The British, of course, established the current borders of what everybody considers Palestine. Historically, there were all kinds of different borders, but the British borders from post-World War I have become the common point of reference. The 1937 partition plan would have created a Jewish state in this area, here in purple, and about 20% of Palestine. The rest of it, most of the rest of it, would have become an Arab state. Well, actually, it would have been annexed to Transjordan, what is now the state of Jordan, and the Jerusalem and a quarter to the sea would remain under the British. The Arabs rejected this plan on grounds that they constituted the majority, and again that the Jews were not a people. The Jews were just a religion. Well, the same response was given 10 years later when the United Nations proposed a partition plan, and the result of that, of course, is what Israelis call the War of Independence, and what Palestinians call Nakba, the disaster. The war, without going into detail here again, created the new map of Israel that we know from, they call it now, 367 lines. It's actually the 1949 armistice lines. Israel, which would have received 56% of Palestine according to the UN plan, came out of the war with 78%. These are the armistice lines of 49. Conflict is now interstate conflict between Arab states and the state of Israel. The Arab states boycott Israel. Before this war, there was a great deal of movement back and forth across these borders, but not afterwards. The Palestinians are temporarily eclipsed. Their leadership is scattered. Half of them are refugees. And what the Arab state that might have been created is not created. You have to remember that none of the Arab parties here favored the idea, so none of them moved to implement it. No Arab state was created. The area that the Transjordanian army conquered became a part of the state of Jordan. To be precise, Transjordan renamed itself Jordan at this point. The Gaza Strip, the only area that the Egyptian army still held at the end of the war, was administered by Egypt, but not annexed. And we had the creation of the refugee issues, an estimated 700 to 750,000 Arab Palestinians who fled into Gaza, the West Bank, the other areas of Palestine, and into the surrounding states. They and their descendants, now it's largely their descendants, today number over 5 million. They're still registered as refugees, probably the longest existing such community in modern history. About 29% of them are still in refugee camps. In other words, the majority actually have to some degree integrated into the areas where they live. We had two wars 56 and 67, both essentially over the same issue, which was the passage of Israeli ships through this strait down here. This is Israel's southern port of Eilat. It's only real access to Asia other than through the Suez Canal, which of course was closed to Israel. 56 war was fought over this, and 67 it was also the main immediate cause of the war. And it ended with Israel in occupation of all of the areas you see here in pink. First of all, the remaining areas of Palestine, Gaza, and the West Bank, Golan Heights on the Syrian border, and this entire Sinai Peninsula, a part of Egypt. You have here, really for the first time, a theoretical basis to make a deal. Before this point, Israel had nothing to bargain with. The Arab states were being asked to make peace with a country whose creation they had opposed from the very beginning. Now that Israel holds territory, at least Egypt and Syria, there's an obvious bargain that's suggested here that in return for the territory being returned to these states, that a peace treaty would be signed. Israel made such an offer to Egypt and Syria. At this point, they were not yet ready for that. Israel administered the West Bank and Gaza under the international law of military occupation, which is a reasonable legal status, but it was never designed to deal with situations that went on for decades. Jewish settlement began in some of these areas, initially in places where Jews had lived before the 48 War and had been expelled, and in areas of strategic importance, particularly the Jordan River, the Golan Heights, and the area separating Gaza from Egypt. Egypt gets a new president in 1970 with the death of Gamal Abdel Nasser. At this point, the common wisdom was that the Arab states had exhausted their military options. After the defeat of 67, it seemed unlikely that they would again resort to any kind of military attack. Sadat disproved that. His idea was a limited attack that would accomplish one immediate end, which was to light a fire under the United States, under Henry Kissinger, to be precise, to get diplomacy moving on these issues. So Egypt and Syria attacked, as I'm sure many of you remember. Those of us who were there at the time remember it very well. On Yom Kippur in 1973. Egypt succeeded in hanging on to a foothold in Sinai, and the attack accomplished its major aim, which was to galvanize Henry Kissinger into action. And we had the disengagement agreements with Egypt and with Syria, and eventually this, well, first of all, Sadat pulled a second surprise. When the diplomatic process kind of stalled, he invited himself to Jerusalem. And all of us also probably remember the unlikely sign of watching television. I brought the television into my class just to see the sight of Sadat getting off the plane in Lod at the Israeli airport. And after some obstacles were overcome, the peace treaty, the first peace treaty between Israel and any of its neighbors, is signed in 1979. Egypt is ostracized temporarily by the rest of the Arab world, but this is a peace that is held now for over 3 decades. Putting this in perspective reminds us that Israel has peace treaties with 2 of its 4 neighbors. And Egypt in 1979, Jordan in 1994, and that these peace treaties have so far held. Should also note that since Egypt was no longer a likely belligerent against Israel, Egypt was not likely to go to war against Israel, that there has been no full-scale war, that the other Arab states, without the support of Egypt, the most important, most powerful Arab state, there really is no option of a full-scale war. And that has been the case since this treaty was signed. You have to look for elements of hope in this situation where you can find them. We now come to the third stage, which, as I say, really has roots back into the 1960s when the Palestinians begin to emerge once again. The PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, was founded in 1964, but it really came into prominence after 67. After the 67 war, which showed that the Arab states could not deliver liberation as they saw it for the Palestinians. This is a young Yasser Arafat here in this picture together with Nasser. The PLO is at one point expelled from Jordan in 1970, and they took over southern Lebanon, which became their last frontier from which they could operate against Israel, which led to Israel's intervention in Lebanon in 1982. And under Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, whose death was just, of course, marked recently, Israel moved all the way to Beirut, and Sharon had a grand vision here of an alliance between Israel and the Christian Lebanese, which would stabilize the entire Middle East. Jordan would become a Palestinian state. None of this, of course, proved to be a practical program. The border afterward, well, first of all, of course, we had the massacre of Palestinians by Christian Lebanese forces in Sabra and Shatila. Israel begins a process of withdrawal, which takes 2 or 3 years, but is carried out. One of the consequences of this campaign, and here I'm laying the roots for the later analysis, was the appearance of Hezbollah, a new kind of actor on the whole scene. And they come about as a result of the Lebanese war. The full emergence of the Palestinians as a central player comes about with the First Intifada in the late 1980s. Low-level violence, protests, civil unrest. At the same time, we have a new Israeli government in 1992 under Yitzhak Rabin, which is interested in looking into options for getting out of this situation. The PLO itself has exhausted really its military options. There's a famous saying that after they had been expelled from Lebanon, and they met in Tunis, they actually established their headquarters in Tunis. Somebody tried to portray this as a victory, and one of the leaders of the PLO said, another victory like this at our next meeting will be in Fiji. But in any event, the PLO was beginning to examine the diplomatic process rather than military or what they call armed struggle. The fall of the Soviet Union plays in here because the Soviet Union, of course, was the main support for most of the radical parties in the area, Syria, the PLO, and others. So we have one of the pleasant surprises of this history, alongside so many catastrophes, that famous handshake on the White House lawn. I think you're all old enough to remember that, right? Look at the body language here. Clinton sort of bringing them together. Arafat beaming, he was a great role player. And Rabin looking like he swallowed a frog. This is certainly a scene that many of us who thought we knew something about this never expected to see. And so we need to remember some of these moments as well. Over the next 8 years, we had the Oslo peace process. We had a number of further agreements. We had the election of the PA, the Palestinian Authority, dominated by the PLO. And we ended up with 40% of the West Bank and 100% of Gaza under Palestinian rule. And that accounts, in fact, for 98% of the Palestinian population. It culminated in Camp David and Taba, the attempt to reach a final agreement. And they came the closest ever, which doesn't mean they came maybe that close. But, for example, on territorial issues in the West Bank, at Taba, which comes right after Camp David in 2001, they were only apart by 3% on the territorial partition of the West Bank. And then the roof fell out. We know what happened with the beginning of the Second Intifada and the collapse of the entire process. This brings me to the fourth stage, which in a way is kind of my major thesis here, that we have seen a fundamental change in the nature of the conflict in the last 10 or 15 years. Consider that up to this point, the driving force of this conflict has been nationalism. Jewish nationalism, Arab nationalism. Religion was not the dominant force. It played a role, religious issues emerged, but religion was not at the core of the conflict. Furthermore, in the last part, before this fourth stage, you saw the trend towards reducing the conflict to the two core parties, the Israel and the Palestinians, which in many ways certainly is good for Israel, instead of having to deal with the entire Arab or Muslim world. But what happened instead, of course, was the thunderous collapse of this entire process, and what I've labeled as the fourth stage. And it seems to me that this is not a superficial kind of thing, that it's rooted in some very basic changes, not just in the Middle East, but throughout the world. The rise of political scientists have invented the term of non-state actors. But think of Hamas, Hezbollah as prime examples here of movements that are not governments, but which play a key role in these situations. And I don't have time to elaborate on any of this, but obviously there's been a change in the nature of warfare. The experts will tell you that the last full-scale conventional war anywhere in the world was the 73 war in the Middle East. You know, tanks lined up against each other, the kind of thing that we're used to. We haven't had that. We've had all these fuzzy wars. They call them sub-conventional, irregular, insurgency. There's a dozen names for them. But they are a different kind of war without clear results. The old kind of wars, at least you knew where you stood. You were losing, you were winning. These kinds of wars, I call them fuzzy wars. Pick your own term. And then we have the rise of religious radicalism, which is too obvious to require too much elaboration. I mean, obviously some of these religious ideologies justify the pursuit of total means by any, of total aims by almost any means. And the suicide bomber, which is a fairly modern phenomenon, comes really in at this point. One example, of course, Lebanon. Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the aftermath of the war there. Hezbollah is a non-Palestinian movement. It is based in the Shia, Muslim Shia community of Lebanon. It's Arab, but it's not Palestinian. And it was inspired and guided by Iran. And Iran's role in this added a new dimension to the conflict. I have another talk on Iran's nuclear capability. Anybody wants to stay until midnight, look at that. But I have to confess here, I've written a basic text on the conflict, which a couple of you have actually read. Norm and Dory. I'll recommend it at the end. But in the first edition, which I finished writing in 2004, I don't mention Iran at all. I was horrified when Iran started to play such a key role. I went to look what did I say about Iran in the book. It's not even in the index, for God's sake, which really is kind of alarming. So the second edition, I assure you, that was corrected. And Iran now plays a key role in the story. But the addition of Iran to the picture here really is a significant strategic shift in the whole situation, even apart from the nuclear dimension of that. And Hezbollah's program really challenges the legitimacy of most of the existing governments in the world, for that matter, not just in the Middle East. Look here at their program. As enunciated in 1985, we see in Israel the vanguard of the United States in our Islamic world. It's not even Israel by itself, it's Israel as a catchpole of the United States. And it's a worldwide struggle. The elimination of Israel presumably wouldn't end any of that. And then, of course, on the model of Hezbollah to a great extent, we have the emergence of Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement, whose Arabic initials Hamas. And this comes about in the late 1980s. And in both Hamas and Hezbollah, there's a triumphal worldview. They are on the side of history. They are on the wave of the future. And they interpret recent history as a series of victories. The expulsion of the Soviet Union from Afghanistan, the exit of the United States from Lebanon in the 1980s, during the Reagan period, think back to that, and later from Somalia, you remember Black Hawk Down, and Israeli withdrawals from Lebanon in 2000, and from Gaza in 2005, which they interpreted as a victory of the armed struggle, not as a conciliatory move by Israel. So, in this framework, Jews are of course seen as the source of the world's problems. I had occasion to show the Hamas covenant in Arabic to people who didn't believe me on this, but it charges the Jews with responsibility for the 2 world wars, for communism, and for capitalism, just to cover all possibilities, for conspiracy to rule the world, quoting the protocols of the elders of Zion, that infamous anti-Semitic forgery. It's quoted in the Hamas covenant. The leader of Hamas was quoted once as saying that the conflict with Israel is not a matter of land. It's a matter of ideology. I would have said that for the first 120 years of this conflict, it pretty much was a conflict over land. I think that's an interpretation that would hold up. But here we have a new kind of actor in the situation who sees it as not a matter of land. Presumably, if you solve the problem of land, you'd still have other things to deal with. It's a matter of ideology. Therefore, there really can't be any peace, no negotiation with Israel, no recognition of Israel. And the Hamas charter, to quote here, this is Hamas, believes that the land of Palestine is an Islamic lot, that means a trust, a religious trust, consecrated for future Muslim generations. It or any part of it should not be squandered, should not be given up. In the photo, incidentally, the previous photo was Hassan Nasrallah, who's the leader of Hezbollah, Lebanese. This is Ahmed Yassin, the former. He was killed in an Israeli attack a few years ago, but he was the founder of Hamas. He's a paraplegic. So this brings us to the point where it became clear to me, at least, that we were dealing with a new stage of the conflict, roughly 2006. In January of that year, there was an election in the Palestinian territories in which Hamas won a clear majority of the seats. And what probably was the freest and fairest election the Palestinians have ever had. There were reasons for this, the corruption of the PA and other things. And Hamas only won 44% of the vote, actually, but it was structured in such a way that the biggest party would get a vast majority of the seats, so that worked to Hamas's favor. Now, Mahmoud Abbas, has been elected separately. He's still in power. The elections are several years overdue. And initially, he formed a unity government with the Hamas majority in the legislature. But in June of 2007, Hamas seized control unilaterally of Gaza, which meant that the unity government was dissolved and the situation was created in which Hamas controls Gaza, the PA or PLO, if you like, controls the West Bank. So it's very difficult to imagine a negotiation that would work in all of the Palestinian areas at the same time. Also in 2006, we had one of these new fuzzy wars. Israel launching a campaign against Hezbollah because 2 Israeli soldiers had been kidnapped. Primarily an air campaign, which was not enough to really defeat Hezbollah, and most people came to the conclusion that Hezbollah was actually the winner, even though they had suffered heavier losses. In fact, 86% of Palestinians felt that Hezbollah had won that war. Again, Israeli withdrawals are seen in this context as a sign of weakness, as a victory for the armed struggle, not as conciliatory gestures. Up to this point, in the years previous to this, there had been a development in Israel of a school of thought favoring unilateral disengagement from the occupied territory, from the West Bank and Gaza. If there's nobody to negotiate with, if you can't reach an agreement, then get out of the occupation business just unilaterally. And it was Ariel Sharon, the superhawk, who took Israeli settlements and Israeli forces out of Gaza unilaterally in 2005. As a result of which, of course, Gaza became a base for the launching of rocket attacks into Israel. So, with a similar result with Hezbollah in the north and Hamas in Gaza, the support in Israel for the idea of unilateral disengagement simply evaporated. It lost whatever appeal it had. And Israeli politics has turned to the right since then. It's not clear. Can you read that? The cartoon from the period that couldn't really. They're giving each other the peace side. And getting some of the rather pessimistic ways of looking at this. There are some other developments here opposed to the trends that I just described. We're always looking for some of the positive signs. First of all, Oslo did leave some positive legacies. It was the first mutual recognition between the recognized leadership of the two sides. It led to the first Palestinian self-governance on Palestinian soil. It led to the second peace treaty in the history of the conflict, peace treaty between Jordan and Israel in 1994. Because once Palestinians were negotiating with Israel, the king was saying if Jordan could allow himself to do the same thing. It's led to ongoing interaction at all levels, official and unofficial, and despite the Intifada and despite all the negative developments. And it led to the first serious negotiations over the basic issues of the conflict. So Oslo, in my view, deserves better than to be regarded as the worst four-letter word in Middle East diplomacy. Secondly, there's been a change in the orientation of some of the Arab states, think Saudi Arabia, Jordan, others, because of the threat of radical Islam. The unofficial cooperation, for example, between Israel and Saudi Arabia has become a matter of great speculation. They both fear Iraq, so it creates common bedfellows, as politics often does. ideologies do tend to decline over time. You see that historically in almost every ideological movement that lost intensity over time. Zionism is an example. Arab nationalism is an example. Who would have thought in 1974 that the PLO would one day accept Israel and sign agreements with Israel against their most fundamental beliefs, and yet it happened. And maybe it'll happen eventually with Hamas. Just a thought to keep in mind. And finally, despite everything, there's still majority support for a two-state solution among Israelis and Palestinians. So I have the latest figures here, a couple months ago. A larger majority on the Israeli side. You might ask, what about the other 47 Palestinians? What do they want? Well, they're all over the map. 25% of them say they want a binational state. I'll talk about that in a minute. 25% or maybe 15% want a unitary Islamic state. You know who they are. So on. But you still have a small majority who would accept a two-state solution. Of course, the devil is in the details. What are the other options? It's been fashionable in academic circles. Academic circles are always on to the latest fad, whatever it is. To push for a one-state solution, one of the ideas pushed is return the West Bank to Jordan. Remember, Jordan controlled it for 20 years anyway. So give it back to them 50 years later, but okay. And give the West Bank back to Egypt, and Palestinians will enjoy self-determination in the framework of Arab states. Well, the Egyptians oppose this, the Jordanians oppose it, and the Palestinians oppose it. So this particular idea has not gained a whole lot of traction. There's much more debate about the idea of a binational state. And you may have seen this, particularly around universities, where they're talking about real radical solutions. A binational state, nobody dominates anybody. All of Palestine, one big happy family. Now you've assumed the solution as a part of choosing that particular option. People who can work well enough together to agree on how to divide all the powers up. What's your flag going to be? What's the name of the country going to be? And so on and so on and so on. Once you reach the point where the two parties can actually agree on all of this, then you've assumed an end to the conflict. Sure, it's attractive. Why wouldn't it be an attractive idea? But the track record for binational states is pretty dismal. I love doing this in Canada. Canada is always cited as one of the successful cases of binationalism, in English and French. And you'd be surprised how often they disagree with this. They don't consider it a success at all. They're still struggling with this. And this is a liberal, democratic Western society. I understand the Belgians wouldn't all agree with this either. This is a success story. But there certainly are plenty of failures to look at. So, the bottom line, it seems to me, is if you can't even agree on terms of separation, how are you going to agree on intimate details of daily cooperation in every area of life? Better a difficult divorce than turbulent cohabitation. And I'm not going to try to generalize on that to other areas of life. Remember that an agreed framework for resolving this has existed only for the last 20 years of a conflict that's lasted for 130. And serious negotiations over the basic issues have taken place really only 3 times, or a few months in total. Camp David talks in Taba, in the last period of the Clinton presidency, 2000-2001. Several months in 2007-2008 between Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president. Here you see them, Omar and Abbas with, I think you recognize the man in the middle, right? President at the time. And in the case of the talks between Omar and Abbas, we have a pretty good idea of where they were headed and how close they got. Because Al Jazeera, the Arabic news organization, leaked 1,600 secret documents 3 years ago to give us a pretty complete picture of this negotiation. And just to summarize briefly, there would be 2 states. I don't know of any serious negotiation on this conflict that has not taken the 2-state model as a basis. None of the people who worked seriously on this have come up with anything better. 2 states with the pre-67 lines as a base for the creation of a Palestinian state, but with Israeli settlements annexed by Israel in return for an equal amount of territory, Israeli territory, to be empty, Israeli territory to be given to the Palestinian state, so that in terms of territory it would come out even. That way you could move something like 80% of the Israeli settlers in the West Bank into Israel without actually moving them. You move the line, you compensate the Palestinians with territory elsewhere. That's been at the basis of all of these talks since 2000, the Camp David talks and the ones that I'm talking about here. In the case of the second set of talks, Abbas or Omar, for Jerusalem, they came up with the idea of an international committee composed of 5 states. Now, bear with me. Palestine, Israel, the United States, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia would govern the holy sites in the Old City. And they created a concept that I'm sure you haven't heard of before, called the Holy Basin, which would be the Old City plus the Mount of Olives. How many of you have been to Jerusalem? Wow. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. You try to combine the Old City with some of the adjoining territory that covers most of the holy sites, and you put that under an international committee. Now, would a committee that had 3 of 5 members would be Arab states, would that ever be acceptable to the Israeli public? Questionable. But nevertheless, that was one of the compromises that was being hashed out. Palestine will be demilitarized. The Palestinian leadership has been surprisingly flexible on this. They recognize that they would never have an army to match Israel's anyway, so they would settle for a strong police force, one capable of keeping internal order, but have no army or air force. Maybe there will be an international force on the Jordan, that border between the new Palestinian state and the Arab world, where we wanted to make sure that forces wouldn't be allowed to cross. The hardest issue, it seems to me, remains the refugee issue, even harder than Jerusalem. 99.8% of the refugees, according to some unofficial polls, insist on their right to return to their original homes. What does that mean? These are refugees from 1948, 1949. More precisely, 90% of them are the descendants of these refugees. What they insist on is their right to return to the homes that their parents, grandparents, or even great-grandparents lived in before 48. Many of these homes, of course, don't exist anymore. They've been swallowed up in Israeli urban development, but this is officially still the claim. When you talk to Palestinian intellectuals, they seem to recognize there is no way 5 million Arabs are going to come back to Israel. It ain't going to happen. Nobody told the refugees. So whatever may be negotiated by the leaders, and this may be one reason that Arafat backed off in the year 2000 at Camp David, They started having riots in the refugee camps when they heard he was going to give away the right of return. This one is a tough one. All right, John Kerry became Secretary of State a year ago, and immediately embarks on a very impressive, energetic effort to revive talks over the key issues. Remember, up to this point, there have only been those 2 short periods when we really had serious negotiations. But Kerry clearly sees this as a key interest of the United States, worth investing a lot of capital and energy in. He put on a full court press, and to the general surprise, he got talks going last July. He did this by talking the Palestinians into not demanding a settlement freeze as a condition for talks. That had been the obstacle for a long time. Instead, they got a prisoner release. Many of the long-term prisoners held by Israel were released. And in response to the Palestinian demand, we put a 9-month deadline on this. The Palestinians were afraid of talks being dragged on forever and ever. As a weaker party, they wanted some sort of terminal date to this, so Kerry said, all right, 9 months. Well, the 9 months are up in less than 3 months, at the end of April. I'll come back to that. So how's it going? When I was asked to speak about current peace talks, my first reaction was, nobody knows. I mean, these are being held behind closed doors. What am I going to say? There's an occasional leak. I'm trying to make the best out of that. But what I'm giving you is more of an analysis of the issues than real inside information. Kerry runs a tight ship. There's been very little leaked out of this, less than one would expect usually. What does seem clear is that there's been a shift from trying to resolve the whole thing by the end of April to just trying to reach a framework agreement. Try to settle the major points, and then we'll take our time filling in the details. And according to Tom Friedman in the New York Times, January 28th, take your leaks where you can get them. I don't know what Tom Friedman's source is. Kerry is suggesting a shared Jerusalem, capital of both countries. There's a plan devised by an American Marine general, retired, for security on the Jordan River, which relies heavily on technology, on sensors and all other kinds of things, to avoid the need for Israeli troops there. There will be no right of return. I've suggested already that's been the sine qua non of any agreement. No right of return for the Palestinian refugees in 48-49. Israel would be recognized as a Jewish state. Now this brings up another point. The Netanyahu government has injected into this negotiation a demand that hadn't been there before, which was that the Palestinians, as part of this, must recognize Israel as a Jewish state, not just as a state, but as a Jewish state. They say they have not been a part of this before. It's also not a part of international recognition generally, that you recognize the ethnic character of whatever state you're dealing with. It's a new kind of demand. The government says that otherwise it's not worth the paper it's written on. I mean, unless the Palestinians really have come to terms with Israel as a Jewish state, so they want it explicit. Palestinians pointed out that neither Egypt nor Jordan was required to make such recognition when they signed peace treaties with Israel. And in any event, it's up to Israel to define itself. Abbas says, who am I to tell the Jews who they are? So, in some ways, they seem to have a very solid argument. The major problem from the Israeli side, bear with me, we have to descend into Israeli politics here. You may recall Israel had an election a year ago. government was set up with Likud, the largest party, Netanyahu, in alliance with the Russian party, and the other two major elements of the government are the Center Party, the second largest in Israel now, which came into being as a protest against the power of the ultra-Orthodox in Israeli society. And nothing to do with Palestinians whatsoever. Yesh Atid, this party, Lapid, got 19 seats on the strength of their program to draft the ultra-Orthodox into the Israeli army, where they're currently not, for the most part, not serving. This government was not structured to deal with the Palestinian issue at all. Lapid, leading this anti-ultra-Orthodox, that's an awkward phrase. In Israel, they say Haredim, right? Ultra-Orthodox. Nobody likes to be called ultra anyway. So let's call them Haredim. Haredim are the so-called ultra-Orthodox. So he aligned himself with the settler party, the party that really represents the settlers in the territories and those who support them. Under Bennett, they got 12 seats. They're, I think, the fourth largest party. Together, they forced Netanyahu to form a government without the ultra-Orthodox, without the ultra-Orthodox. Everybody follow all that? What it means is, of course, that this government really can't deal with the Palestinian issue without restructuring itself. The settler party is the only party in Israel. It's called Habayit Yehudi, Jewish army. It's the only party in Israel that is totally opposed, in principle, to a Palestinian state of any kind. And they have 10% of the seats. That also tells you how much Israeli opinion on this has shifted. 90% of these people, as the members, are willing to accept the Palestinian state one way or another, sometimes under terms that the Palestinians would accept, but only 10% are opposed in principle to the idea of a two-state solution to this. Obviously, this government is not going to be able to move unless the settler party is replaced by parties of the center or left. And of course, Netanyahu will not do until he gets to a point at which this becomes really important. So just to quickly summarize on the issues outstanding. Territory. Actually, this may not be the most difficult issue. As I said, on the West Bank, Gaza is conceded to the Palestinians. On the West Bank, they were 3% apart in 2000. Here are, in blue, are the Jewish settlement blocks on the West Bank. And here are the areas that have been proposed in previous talks, Israeli areas to be annexed to the Palestinian state as territorial compensation, which you see here in tan. Areas around the southern part of the West Bank and around Gaza, and up here. Israel proposed in the past an exchange of 6% of the West Bank, which they claim would bring 80% of the settlers into Israel. The Palestinians proposed apparently 2%. Just a few of the basic settlements, and it was described by the Israeli negotiators as balloons. You would have the settlement become a part of Israel, but be connected to Israel by a road, by a string, or like a balloon. So 2%, 6%, in either case you have an equal exchange of territory, but that was the range of debate at that time. Thing is, that if Israel did try to annex all of the West Bank, it would cease to be a Jewish majority state within a few years. And people on the right in Israel can count just as well as people on the left. So if you want a state that is both Jewish and democratic, there's no way that you could incorporate the majority of the West Bank population into it. So Ariel Sharon evacuated Gaza. One of the few leaks in current talks has it that Netanyahu has proposed that 4 settlement blocks be annexed to Israel. Ariel is here in the territory, this whole block. The Beit El, here, Malay Adunim, east of Jerusalem, and the Etzion block, south of Jerusalem. I don't have any figure on how much of the West Bank that means, but it seems to me it means more than 6%. So if that's the case, then Netanyahu is demanding more than Omer did a few years ago. Jerusalem. Back in the year 2000, President Clinton proposed what seemed to be a logical idea: Arab neighborhoods to be a part of the Palestinian state, Jewish neighborhoods to be a part of Israel. Well, look at the map. The blue are Jewish neighborhoods. This is the border before 1967 here. And of course, that's all Jewish. But in the, what was previously the West Bank, you have all of these neighborhoods in blue here, built since 1967. The orange are the Arab neighborhoods. Now, draw me a line that separates one from the other. Here's one proposal. It still incorporates a lot of Arab neighborhoods into Israel, but it does manage to incorporate most of the Jewish neighborhoods into Israel as well. But then, of course, you have the Old City. Can anybody see the Old City in this map here? Here's the Old City. It's 1% of the area of Jerusalem. Right? 1%. It's here. Okay, Old City under the Jordanians before 67. Since then, the Jewish quarter here has been rebuilt. Israeli opinion is strongly opposed to any redivision of the Old City, especially to giving up the old, any redivision of Jerusalem, and especially giving up the Old City. On the other hand, here you have in the corner of the Old City the third holiest place in Islam, the 2 mosques, the Mosque of Omar, and it's not the Mosque of Omar, it's actually the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa. Together comprise the third holiest place in Islam. And no Israeli government has tried to change the fact of Muslim administration from that area, even though this is the Temple Mount, the holiest place in Judaism. Refugees may be the most difficult issue. I said that already. There are over 5 million of them. There's no way that the state of Israel will absorb even a significant part of that population. But again, nobody has told the refugees this. Nevertheless, it may not be impossible. I have here a poll, a survey that was carried out about 10 years ago by a Palestinian academic whom I know. He's the best survey researcher on the Palestinian side. It was hard to do. He had to kind of do this in a sneaky way, go ahead and ask refugees what they would actually choose if they had to choose. Nobody had been allowed to do this before. He kind of did it quietly, and he published his results. Only 10% said they would want to return to their original homes in what is now Israel. Others would stay where they are with compensation or resettle elsewhere. 40% of them are already in the West Bank and Gaza, incidentally, and have been, in fact, at least partly integrated there. So 70% more or less said they would accept compensation. Now, when Khalil Shikaki, the researcher here, published this, his offices were ransacked. There was quite a violent reaction to the fact that he would publish this data, because this was not something that they wanted publicized. But if these indicate really what choices would be, then that narrows the gap quite a bit. 10% would still be 500,000, which is far more than any government of Israel, right, left, center, whatever, any government of Israel would accept. Israel has offered 5,000, 15,000 in that way, a kind of symbolic return program. So, looking at general trends over the last few decades, I think we can see the emerging contours of what a final settlement will look like when it comes about. 2 states, still the only model that seems workable. Borders basically the pre-67 lines with land swaps to incorporate the Israeli settlers into Israel, Jewish settlers in the West Bank. Jewish Jerusalem to Israel, Arab Jerusalem to Palestine, Palestine demilitarized, and refugees to go to the Palestinian state or be settled elsewhere. This is then the 2 main negotiators at present, Tzipi Livni of Israel and Saeb Erekat of the PA, and this is one of the photos from one of their sessions. Again, we don't know a whole lot about what has actually transpired. But it does seem clear from looking at the issues that the ultimate trade-off here, if one is to ever get to a final settlement, will involve both sides agreeing to something that they find at the moment difficult, if not impossible to do. On the Palestinian side, Palestinians have to come to terms with the fact that 5 million Palestinians are not going back to Israel. In fact, only a tiny fraction of that number. Israel has a 20% Arab minority. This already is something that they've struggled with to integrate them into Israel. The idea of substantially changing that ratio isn't going to be accepted by any Israeli government. Right, Senator Dowty? Somebody has to someday tell refugees they are not going back to where their grandparents came. Now, here's the other one. Wait for this. What is Israel going to have to accept that it will find extremely hard to accept? There is no way that the Muslim control of the 3rd holiest site in Islam is going to be shared. It ain't going to happen. Not even the most hawkish government in Israel has dared to tamper with the Muslim Waqf control of what the Arabs call, or the Muslims call, a mobile sanctuary, and what Israelis call the Temple Mount. And so there we are. That seems to me is the ultimate trade-off that has to be made, and I don't see any chance of it happening sooner. It's much easier to predict the content of an agreement than to predict when. I think the general trends that I've given, looking at this in the long term, historically, gives some basis for hope. Basically, the trends, despite the last few years, historically the trends have been toward narrowing the gap. I hope you've seen this. But it's a fair guess that this won't happen before the end of April. Thank you. Okay, we're promised to ask questions, and this is usually the best part. Yes.
You didn't say much about Iran and their nuclear potential and the fear of Israel and what will they accept? They're a power.
Yeah, well, there's different dimensions to the Iranian threat. Some of them involve their support of Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a spoiler here. And so that's what would worry me in the context of what I just presented. The nuclear issue, of course, is a different question. And if you take a close look at that agreement that was just settled, I think it has some signs of promise in it. I think the Iranians are enough under stress from the sanctions. The sanctions are working well, and done pretty well. And apparently Rouhani has been given enough slack here, since the Iranians have not yet made a decision to go for that final sprint to the actual weapons. They just have been building the basis for doing that. But I think there's a possibility that at the end of the 6 months we might have a workable deal. We'll wait and see. I'm more hopeful about that than I've been in a long time. But then you're left, of course, with the other elements of the Iranian policy, particularly their support of Hezbollah. And there, of course, strategies to try to isolate the bad guys as much as you can. Yes?
Matthew?
Given the two sides we share the same source of clean water, what has been discussed either historically or currently about how that resource would be shared?
It's a good question about water. I enumerate usually 4 areas of what we call the final status talks. It's territory, including the settlements, Jerusalem, security issues, and refugees. The 5th could be water. And these have been a part of past talks. Aquifers, the places where you draw the water, don't pay any attention to political borders. So there have to be some agreements here on the sharing of these resources. And this could turn into one of the more difficult issues because the amount of water is limited. There recently was an agreement. I don't know if it didn't get much publicity. I heard about it because I was listening to news in French. I'm trying to improve my French, and the French thought it was important. But I didn't see it in any English source. Jordan, the PA, and Israel recently reached an agreement for desalination at Aqaba, on the Gulf of Aqaba, and sharing the water that would be produced from this, which would not be a great quantity, but would help. And then putting the brine that's left into the Dead Sea, which is full of brine already anyway, is shrinking. So maybe that's a harbinger of better cooperation yet to come.
Just a moment.
I can get it. With the UN always stopping Israel from building apartments and things for the refugees, I mean, how can they justify that? I mean, why are we going along with that? They've offered numerous times to build housing and apartments and things, and they always...
Well, actually, there were experiments in Gaza, particularly, of course, where the crowding was terrible. After '67, when Israel was in charge, they offered to build houses. And the answer to your question, in short, is that the Palestinians won't accept that. To them, this is like giving up their right of return. They have in some ways become permanent residents where they live, but they officially have not become permanent residents, and they tend to resist anything that suggests a permanent acceptance of anything except going back to their homes.
Isn't that keeping them as a pawn to twist Israel's arm?
Well, the Arab states have done that, but I think the important point is the Palestinians themselves. Like I said, nobody's told the refugees. I mean, Saeed Nusayr, the president of Al-Quds University, is one of the more intelligent and modern Palestinian intellectuals, said this out loud a few times and was practically lynched for it. He's a guy from a prominent family with a great deal of stature, and he couldn't get away with saying this out loud. So it's just a mind frame that rejects any suggestion of making this permanent. Even though, how many of you seen a refugee camp? You know, some of these camps have become villages. I mean, they've become more permanent over the course of time. They're not living in tents anymore. The conditions, of course, are not as good as those in the villages around. But nevertheless, after 50 years, 65 years to be exact, things do change. They acquire more permanence. And the statistics that I showed you showed that many people in the West Bank, in fact, would remain there. They would want compensation for what they lost, but they have in fact resettled. So over the course of time, I said only 29% are still in the refugee camps. Higher in some areas than others. The worst situation is Lebanon. Because in Lebanon, the government has done everything they could to prevent the Palestinians from integrating into their own society. They have too many splits and so on already, as they see it. So that's where it's at. I mean, things that Israel might have done for the refugees over the course of time have generally not been acceptable to the refugees, particularly if it comes from Israel.
I just wanted to comment on the water situation that you answered in response to the earlier question. According to our son who lives in Israel, they now get fully half or more of their water from desalinization.
Really?
Yes.
Where's that?
Yes. Pardon me?
Where?
In Israel, the whole country.
All
Fully
country?
half- Yes, half the water now comes from desalinization plants. There are numerous plants. That new one that they're building south, the Red to Dead project, as they call it, will be divided amongst the three entities you mentioned. The leftovers to replenish the Dead Sea, hopefully. Environment is unsure about that. But fully half the water in Israel comes from desalinization. That's been going to increase over time. So I'm hoping that that isn't really going to be an issue in the future for any of the peoples in that
Well, it would be
area.
nice if there were a technical solution provided enough
There's
water.
certainly plenty of ocean.
I'll have to check that out. I have not heard that, and it sounds kind of amazing. I'll have to check it out.
Hi. Okay, so I hear what you are saying about how Abbas and Arafat say, you know, who are we to define Israel? All of a sudden, it seems that Netanyahu is saying you have to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Okay, so that's not going to come out of their mouth. But how then can there be something that acknowledges the end of the conflict? What will give Israel any confidence that signing an agreement, assuming they get through all of these issues, you know, that this will end the conflict? Is that also some language that Palestinians are not willing to insert into a final agreement, or have they said?
Actually, in the current talks, one thing has leaked out is that it's Hamas who's insisting that this be defined as the end of the conflict. The current leadership, not of Hamas, but of the PA, Hamas in particular, are insisting that this be declared the end of the conflict because they're afraid of further Israeli settlement and, you know, that it's not final, that there will be more encroachment and so on. So they're the ones who want to end the conflict. Now, how do you write that into an agreement to make sure? I mean, the theorists of international relations will tell you that the agreement has to be such that either side would lose more than they would gain if they violate it. That's what gives you confidence and will be respected. And I take the example of Israel and Egypt, the Sinai, being returned to Egypt. The structure of the situation was that the Israeli army could go back in and take over Sinai in a few days. They're much more mobile, more powerful than the Egyptian army. The Egyptians are not allowed to fortify Sinai. So Sinai, in a sense, is a hostage for Egyptian, honoring Egyptian respect for the agreement. When the Egyptians do anything warlike towards Israel, Sinai could be reoccupied very quickly. And you build things into it like that give each side an interest in the fact that you're keeping the agreement. I assume any agreement made would have to have those sorts of things in it. The use of a NATO force has been suggested. We talked about along the Jordan River. Netanyahu wants Israeli troops. He wants Israeli troops for 10 years. Abbas doesn't want any Israeli troops on Palestinian territory. So So the Allen plan was supposed to use a lot of sensors and other kinds of things, plus an international force, NATO, in which both sides presumably would have some confidence. The same with some of the other issues.
We'll take like 2 more questions.
I have all night.
The idea of an international force, NATO or another enforcer. I think most Israelis, and not only those old enough to remember 1956, when the international force, including the United States, Britain, and France, that basically was pulled out of there at the request of Oslo Nazi, and we started in 1956 war. The Israelis are not going to forget that. That is very, very
That's a good point. In the international force has to be given a clear mandate, but even more important are the national interests of the countries who are contributing the troops. What happened in '67, when the UN, the first ever UN peacekeeping force was between Egypt and Israel, from 56 to 67. It evaporated in '67 because all of the countries that contributed the troops were friends of Egypt. And when Nasser said he wanted them out, poor old Lutak, I won't have a chance to talk to Lutak, if I remember Lutak, who was U.S. Secretary General at the time and was blamed for the firemen that went home when there was a fire. And it seemed reasonable to blame the UN. The force was supposed to be there to prevent a war. The minute there's a danger of a war, it disappears. Well, Lutak said to me, I have a photo of it. Anyway, he said, the Yugoslavs, the Indians, everybody but the Canadians had already announced they were withdrawing their troops. It was not even a UN decision, it was done by the countries contributing the forces. That's why I think they're suggesting NATO. NATO means the US. It means countries who would have a very definite interest in keeping peace there and would be strong enough to do it. They're supposed to have some sort of symbolic contingent from Fiji. Fiji is a great contributor to international peacekeeping because they make money on this. But they're not going to stick around and actually get hot, I don't think. It's going to be very effective. But NATO force, depends on how it's structured, but if the countries behind it really feel a national interest in keeping this stable, then it wouldn't be the same story.
All right, one more question.
If Israel is sincere in its support of the two-state solution, how does it justify the ongoing construction of settlements in the West Bank?
Okay. The question, of course, about the settlements, the support for them in Israel. As I'm sure you all know, there are very vociferous debates going about this within Israel. The people have been saying since '67 that it was not a smart idea to begin building any in the first place, or at least not in places where there hadn't been Jewish settlements before. The Israeli position, if you had to defend it at the UN and elsewhere, would be this. The West Bank was never officially a part of Jordan. It was never recognized as a part of Jordan, except by Britain and Pakistan. The only successor state to the British mandate is Israel. Therefore, Israel has some tentative rights in there, and the territory itself is in suspension. In international law, you call this missing reversion. Got that? There's a legal case to be made that this is open territory and so on. Now, practically speaking, the Israeli government would probably say there have been no new settlements since 1992, since Yitzhak Rabin became prime minister. Officially, that's true, what there has been a doubling of the number of settlers within the existing settlements. And then there are definitional issues. If you have a settlement that spreads onto the next hilltop over, is that a new settlement or is that still part of the original? So there's playing around with the definitions. The truth is that there is a very dedicated and devoted part of the Israeli public who sees this as a divine mission. And they've been creating facts now for a long time. But the majority of the Israeli public repeatedly in polls say that if this were the cost of a peace treaty, a believable peace treaty, that they would be willing to evacuate most of the settlements, if not all of them. So the support for it is support for the settlements is kind of squishy. It's a small minority which has acted, let's give them credit. Sometimes a great person will sacrifice and risk to do what they believe in and to create facts. And the rest of the government's been kind of permissive about it, and therefore we have the situation we have. I'll tell you the truth, when I look at the map and try to figure out how you're going to annex 6% of the West Bank and get 80% of the settlers into that, even with the most convoluted kinds of lines, I can't quite see it. I think in the end you're going to have to evacuate a lot more than 20% of the settlers. That's a long answer to, but it's, of course, as you know, a very delicate question. So.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of the Jewish Federation of Fort Wayne, I want to thank you for coming out this evening and for supporting this series. Please make sure that if you have not given us an email address, that you give us that. And again, I want to thank Dr. Dowty for this very enlightening talk. Thank you, and we'll see you at the next series.